Hi, everybody. I'm an alcoholic, and my name is Mickey Strother. And I want to tell you this. First thing I want to do is I want to thank the committee. I've been in the Ruston police station before, but not quite in this capacity. They used to request my presence every now and then, back a few years ago. And when Roy called to invite me up here last year, it was with a lot of mixed emotions that I said yes. Now, I did not hesitate to say yes, because that's what I've been taught, that in this fellowship, when I'm asked to do anything, if the day's open, then it's yours. But it brought back a lot of feelings and a lot of memories of this area. And a lot of you know this is a scary thing, coming back home to face people that knew you when. And thank God Joe's sitting over there, and Joe said, I'm going to be sitting here to keep you honest this morning. And I want you to know you're not the first. Billy said it. Don said it. And I want to thank the committee for inviting me. I can't tell you what this weekend has meant for me and my family. There are a lot of things that I want to share today, but I don't know what's going to happen. I went in the bathroom a few minutes ago, and there were people looking at me weird when I was on my knees in front of that toilet, you know. And it wasn't because I was throwing up. Don C. last night, God bless him, Don looked at me and he said, come here. And he said, boy, this has been a good weekend. Don't you mess it up in the morning. With friends like that, why do you need enemies, you know? I don't know. It's a heck of a deal. And I'm here to tell you that the only reason I'm here today and the only reason I'm here sober is because of God's grace. And God's grace alone, and that is sufficient. Because in 46 years of living, I never did anything to warrant the life that I have been given today. And my book tells me that we have been given a new life. Our book talks about something else real special to me. And it's something people used to talk to me about all the time. You even did it when I got to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I did not understand why you were talking to me about my attitude. But everybody along the way just seemed to, at some time, want to bring up my attitude. And I had one. A bad one's worse than none at all. I don't know about you people. And an old man pointed out to me that this entire program is based on a change in attitude and a new relationship. And I wasn't uncomfortable with new relationships. I'd had a lot of them. Any of you had that kind of thing going on in your life? Thank God, rejoice. I told her yesterday, I said, I don't even have to talk in the morning. You told my story. And what's amazing, darling, I don't know how we missed each other at the Rio Pall Mall, but we'd have heard each other. I used to leave Shreveport headed there on Women's Day, stop by, cash a check, make sure it was at a place I hadn't cashed one earlier that week at. You had to be careful where you stopped and wrote checks. Some people get to know you. I don't know. Anybody know anything about hanging paper? There's a difference in writing hot checks and hanging paper. And I may talk about that eventually. I was born in a little town, and that's pretty obvious I was born. And the way I talk, it's obvious it was a little town. 21 miles up the road. And I never will forget, as a kid growing up, I had an attitude about that place. It may not be the end of the world, but you can darn sure see it from here. And when I get big enough, I'm out of here. I'm gone. And that started my life. I said I'm an alcoholic. And I need to clear something up right at the first part of this. Because I am not an alcoholic because my father drank alcohol compulsively. I am not an alcoholic because I had an uncle sober up in this fellowship in 1970. And he used to be my drinking buddy. And after he sobered up, I wouldn't even talk to him. And he used to wear one of those pins in his pocket. Ken had one last night. You ever see those ballpoint pens with the praying hands on them? I could spot that sucker from 800 yards and get nervous. Did not want to be around that man. I'm an alcoholic because alcohol did for me something that nothing else had ever done for me in my life. And I'm an alcoholic because I used it and I abused it to the point to where I lost the choice in drink. My book talks about the fact that we're like men and women who have lost their legs, and we never grow new ones. And it talks about placing yourself beyond human aid. And I love the doctor's opinion in our book. It describes me long before I ever took my first drink of alcohol. Long before. It says they are restless, irritable, and discontented. And that used to fit me perfectly. My family will attest to that. Thank God they didn't take me to a psychiatrist when I was a kid. They would have diagnosed me as ADHD, Hell, I was just restless, irritable, and discontented. And what's amazing to me, and I felt that way, unless I could at once feel the ease and comfort that came with getting my way. I don't know if anybody else can relate to getting your way and how it would make your world better. There are pictures of me in the family album with cousins and relatives, and one stands out in my mind. They're all gathered around about a 1942 Ford. And everybody's smiling at the camera. And I'm facing the car with my butt facing the camera. I did not get what I wanted that day, and I was restless, irritable, and discontented. It talks about we get to a point we can't differentiate the true from the false. I don't know if there's anybody else in here like me. I think I started lying shortly after I started talking. And my family helped me. They asked me questions that I didn't know the answer to. But they deserved an answer. And I gave them one. I'm not an alcoholic because I came from a dysfunctional family. Everything my family did was functional. I'm an alcoholic because I'm one of those people that my body reacts differently to alcohol than other people's. And what's scary for me is that I got a mind that's crazy enough to give me alcohol, and I did it for 32 years of my life. I can remember when I was a senior in high school, I was really preparing to get out of that town, and probably one of my first highs that I ever had in my life was athletics. And I was born on this earth with a lot of God-given talents, and a lot of people helped me develop those talents. And I had made up my mind I was getting out of that little town, and I had offers to play ball at several different universities. And I really got out of that town. I came 21 miles down the road to Ruston, Louisiana. I hit Ruston in the late 50s with a lot of hope and a whole bag full of dreams. And I just knew I had arrived. Things were going to be good. And I got here, and I started meeting the guys that were going to be my teammates. And then something happened to me that has always happened to me, and I can't explain it to you. I don't know where it comes from. I was a kid that was loved a lot. But I just felt like I wasn't loved enough. I don't know if anybody else has ever had that feeling. And I got here, and like it had been most of my life, people had told me I was special, but I didn't feel special. People had talked to me about my potential, God, I knew I had potential, but I just couldn't seem to live up to the potential I knew was there. And I met those teammates, and I got to looking at them. And my God, most of those guys had a senior class at their school that was bigger than my whole school. And I thought, what am I doing here? I don't belong here. I listened to people that had 500, 600 in their graduating class. We had 75. And I thought, what do they want me here for? I did what I always do. I stuffed it down, and I said, well, I'm good enough, and I'll be here. And I remember that I started playing ball, and a lot of people helped me, and I am so fortunate. My life was good. But something happened for me in Ruston, Louisiana that had not happened before. I started drinking at the age of 12, got serious about it about age 14. And for the first time ever, I was allowed to drink the way I wanted to and needed to drink when I got to Ruston, Louisiana. And that's one of the reasons these people used to like to talk to me at the police department and in Monroe, El Dorado. I don't understand people that have never been to jail, Redois. I just don't understand them. I have trouble comprehending one marriage. Anybody else have trouble with that? I look at people questioningly when they say they've only been married once. And I think, my God, you can't be like me. I remember I started getting some letters from some professional ball clubs when I was here at Tech, and I thought, boy, you have got to really get yourself together. Because all I ever wanted to do was play professional football. That was it. My one life goal was to be a professional athlete. And you know what's amazing to me? I was about to ruin that, and I knew it was time to settle down, and I met her. God, was that a relationship? Any of you ever have trouble with your money when you were drinking? Have trouble with your funds? Weird things used to happen to me. I would get these envelopes from the bank, and they would have these windows with a little pink piece of paper in there, and I would open it up, and it would say insufficient funds. And my attitude was, let's find a bank that does have sufficient funds. That one would come back to haunt me. When I met her in Bossier City, and if you don't remember the Bossier Strip from the late 50s, you may not qualify for this program. I don't know. But I met her over there, and it was a match made in heaven. Gorgeous young woman, loved to dance, loved to drink. And then the prime asset came clear at breakfast that morning. She worked for a bank. And therefore, my first real meaningful relationship started to blossom. That was on November the 15th, and December the 27th, we embarked on the matrimonial seas of bliss. And that's a lie. We started, but it wasn't bliss. I settled down somewhat, and what was amazing to me is that before long, I was back drinking the way I needed to drink, and the opportunity for me to further my career took place. And strangely enough, a part of my story started here at Tech that I will not talk about too much, but if you want to talk one-on-one, we'll talk about it. And it happened when I was a freshman here at Louisiana Tech. I was introduced to the wonderful world of amphetamines. And from that point, amphetamines, cocaine, crystal meth, a lot of other drugs would be a part of my life. But what I want to share with you today is that I'm an alcoholic who took a lot of drugs. And I found that out in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because in 1972, with a sufficient enough reason, I quit shoving cocaine in my veins. And I have not done it since June of 1972. But what my book says about me came real clear to me. Because every time that I truly wanted to quit drinking alcohol, I was unable to do it. And when drinking, I had little or no control over the amount I drank. And I found two simple questions in that book to answer whether or not I was an alcoholic or an addict. I'm an alcoholic who took a lot of drugs. And the combination of alcohol and the other goodies I took ended that first career of mine before it ever got off the ground. And I remember I left there and went to work for a major oil company, and God, did they make a mistake. They gave me a company car, credit cards, an expense account, and sent me to New Orleans, Louisiana. And I'm here to tell you that I had arrived. And they told me to entertain customers, Julius. And I smiled. And I did it. And it wasn't too many months till they realized they had made a mistake. And they did what people have done to me all my life. At some point, they'd talk to me about my potential, and then they would ask the same question. They'd look at me, and they'd get that serious look, and they'd say, "What is wrong with you?" And I'd shrug my shoulders and say, "I don't know." And I didn't. You know what's amazing to me? I walked into rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and y'all told me what's wrong with me, and nobody asked the question anymore. I got the answer. Nobody asked the question. They look at me strange. They just don't ask it anymore. Right after that, I got a notice. It was the early 60s, and I got a notice from the draft board in Farmerville, Louisiana. I didn't have sense enough to move my registration to New Orleans, where they had a much greater source of males to draw from. And I thought, well, that's not real special, and I don't want to be in the Army. So I thought, well, what's special? And everybody in my family had been in the Army, Navy, Air Force. Anybody want to guess what I did? I joined the Marine Corps. They were looking for a few good men, and I qualified. I knew that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I wasn't going to be just a regular Marine. If I couldn't be a pilot, I was not going to play their game either. And I took the test, and I qualified for flight school and officer's candidate school. And they got me out of New Orleans, and they saved my life. And for a period of time, I was separated from alcohol and all the other things I did. And what's amazing to me, I did what I was always able to do. I could always get there. I could get the good job. I could get the good things in my life. But I never could stay there. I'm a starter. I'm not a finisher. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that. God, my intentions were good. And you just made the habit of grading me on my actions. I wanted to be a good son. I wanted to be a good brother. I wanted to be a good father. I wanted to be a good husband. I wanted to be a good employee. When I got to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was a total success. I wasn't like you, Redois, or Larry, and George that I heard Thursday night, or Mary. I was a total success when I got here. A total success at being a failure in every area of my life. And I had done it well, because I had alienated everyone that I ever came in touch with. I didn't know how to live life. You know what's amazing to me? Our book talks about the one thing that's on my mind this morning. I could have been anything I ever wanted to be. The one ingredient that needed to be there was missing. The needed power was not there. The needed power. And I had no idea what it was or where to find it. And I struggled all my life, not even knowing what I needed or what I wanted. You know what this program tells me? It's amazing. It says something in the book about when we take such a position, we have a new employer. And being all powerful, He provides what we need. But there's a catchphrase right behind that. And I kept missing that. As long as we stick close to Him and perform His work well, is what it says. You know, I grew up in that Baptist church up there, the one up on Main Street with the big 4 white columns. I tried to find it there and was real active. I found it for a number of years there till I was about 12 years old. And then one day I heard that preacher, and it was Sunday night, and we were up in the balcony where all the young people usually got till they ran us downstairs. And I heard him say, if you're thinking it, it's as bad as doing it. And there was a blonde on the left and a brunette on the right. And if he didn't get me for that, he was going to get me for stealing the president of the bank's hubcaps last Wednesday night at prayer meeting. And I made a conscious decision. The Baptist church wasn't for me anymore. And when I got to Tech, my roommate was from New Orleans. And he was Catholic. And I watched him. They could dance with the girls. They could party. They could drink. They could go in the booth and do a little talking to a priest and go do it the next day. And I decided I was going to be Catholic. And it worked for me for a while. Then in the 60s, I became agnostic. Didn't know what it was, but it sounded good. And you didn't talk to me about God. And then I joined the Second Baptist Church. And then in 1985, I joined the Forsyth Church of Christ, 31 miles down the road in Monroe. I have been dipped, sprinkled, dunked, and redipped. And I didn't find it till you people found me. I went in the Marine Corps, and as usual, things happen. And you know what? It was amazing. A guy that I'd played ball against when I was in college was one of the coaches at one of the bases that I got assigned to. And I made it through flight school and got my way. Oh, boy, I was ready. Marine officer, pilot, cocky. Picture that. It's not real hard to do, knowing me today, is it? And I remember I got transferred to Pensacola, Florida one more time. And a lot of things happened in my life in Pensacola, Florida. I hit there, I was playing football, I was flying 4 hours a month, and that was the only duty I had. And I was running with the district attorney's brother. And I rarely wore a uniform. I dressed about the way I am today. And I thought I was somebody. And any of you ever go to jail on a regular basis? I don't know how many times I went to the Escambia County Jail, but it was a bunch. And I remember the first time they ever put me in that jail. Put me in a 4-man cell, and there was no boy sitting on the upper right-hand bunk, and it was just me and him in there. And I walked in, and he says, "You got a cigarette, man?" And I said, "Yeah." And I reached in my pocket, and I threw him a whole pack. And I said, "Keep it, I won't be here long." That was in 1966. And what's amazing for me is that never occurred to me that my attitude had anything to do with me being in that jail. And I don't know how many times I was in that jail, but I will remember and share with you briefly that in the spring, early spring of 1967, because of what our book talks about, it says that he will someday control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. And it says that the persistence of this illusion is astonishing. And what I want to share with you this morning is what it says next is exactly what occurred for me. It says that some of us follow it into the gates of insanity and death. And I was in the grip of that insanity in early 1967 and had been for far longer than I knew. And I remember the morning it happened. I'd been running from the police 8 to 10 days. I hadn't bathed, I hadn't shaved. I'd been breaking in one house right after another. And I remember the morning they finally threw my face in that sand as the sun was coming up and put the cuffs on me, and I remember what a relief it was. Because I couldn't run anymore. I was tired. And one more time they put me in the Escambia County Jail. And that same old boy was in that same cell. I don't know what he did. We didn't ever talk too much. And he asked me, he said, "Have you got a cigarette?" And I said, "Yeah." And I pulled out one crumpled up cigarette and threw it up to him, and he lit it and he grinned and he said, "Boy, you know you were right." And I ignored him. He said, "You were right." And I finally said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Man, you don't ever stay long, but damn, you come often." And that was my life. That was my life from 1952 when I started drinking till the day I had my last drink of alcohol. It describes it perfectly. What I would like to do I don't know if you can understand. Maybe I qualify to be here. I hope I've cleared that up. Because you know how to drink if you're like I am and you're in this room. The thing I didn't know was how to stop. And what I want to share with you is a journey that started for me not in the late 50s when I came to Ruston, but it started for me in a fourth marriage that was on shaky ground. And it started for me on a morning about 3 o'clock in the morning when I was sitting by myself screaming at a God I did not know. And the place I want to carry you to is 1976. In a third marriage. Separated for I don't know how many times. I had worked for a lot of major oil companies and my life was good at various points. I could get there, but I couldn't stay there. And I reached the point our book talks about. It talks about we couldn't make a living. It talks about a feeling of pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. And God bless that old man that taught me what this book says. And I don't like what it says. But it says, when we found ourselves alcoholic, defeated by a self-imposed crisis. It says we could no longer postpone or evade. And you know, I found myself in 1976 in a third marriage. No longer could get a job anywhere, and a friend of the family had given me a job, and it was only because he was a good personal friend of my mother and my father. And what's amazing to me, my dad, in 1967, when I took that last fall, which was a federal rap in Florida, came to Florida and he bailed me out of jail one more time. And it was almost 2 weeks back here in Louisiana before I was doing what they put me in the same jail for in Florida. And in 1976, I went back to a big empty house. And I remember that the pain of living was more than I could stand. And I remember cussing a God I didn't know and I didn't want to know, and I told him to leave me alone a long time before, because all my friends had died in Vietnam and I was still hurting. And I couldn't get any relief. I'd quit all the dope in 72. The drinking was still working, but not the way I needed it to work. And I went to a closet. And you know what our book says? Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problem. And I took a gun and I put it to my chest and I pulled the trigger. And I wound up in a hospital in that goofy little town where I was born, dead on arrival, August of 1976. I know today, because of inventories, that my problem is I'm selfish and I'm self-centered. And with no thought of children who loved me, with no thought of parents who loved me, I had to have my relief. And I've heard people talk to me and say, my God, I wanted to do that, but I didn't have the courage. And I want to share with you, it doesn't take courage. The pain of living has to be more than you can stand. And if you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. Next thing I remember, I'm listening to a doctor tell me, Mr. Strother, we may do a colostomy. We may have to do this, but don't worry. Everything's going to be all right. And my exact words were to him, get the hell away from me and leave me alone, because you don't know what you're talking about. See, because I knew nothing was ever going to be all right. And I don't know how many days later I came to, but I was in intensive care, and there were tubes coming out of the hole I had made, tubes coming out of the holes they had made. And the only thing I could feel was anger. And I cussed a God I did not know, because I was still alive. Any of y'all ever talk to psychiatrists? People requested that I talk to them on a frequent basis at various points in my life. I remember 1966 down in Florida. They requested me to sit with a whole panel of doctors for a solid week. They were trying to figure out why a Marine officer and a pilot kept doing the things I was doing. And you know what's amazing to me? I had the privilege, November of 95. God has blessed me in that I do a lot of things that I could not have done ever in my life. And I've been involved with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for over 5 years now, and on a totally different basis than I used to be. And they had to do an extensive background check on me one more time. And you know what I found out in November of 95? Do you know that the FBI's memory is better than mine? They brought up things that from 30 years ago that I had neatly tucked away. And any of you ever have to get letters of disposition? If you have, you know what I'm talking about. And I got the privilege of getting some papers from St. Louis, Missouri, from the Military Records Archives. And I got to read what those psychiatrists said about me in 1966. And it says, Lieutenant Strother knows that what he's doing is detrimental to himself, to the Marine Corps, and to the naval services of this United States. But he has no idea why he's doing it. And he says, after a week, we don't either. Psychiatrists could not help me. I'm not going to be honest with those people. If I tell them what's going on up here, they ain't going to let me go. God, if I could have got it down to 2 of us, we'd have been all right. You know, I'd love to stand here and tell you that when I walked out of that hospital in West Monroe, Louisiana, that was the last drink of alcohol I ever took. And I knew when I walked out I could no longer drink. And I made it damn near 24 hours. And I bought a case of beer and a fifth of scotch. And I was cut from my sternum to my crotch. They had removed one kidney and I don't know how many feet of intestines. And I removed the stitches and never went back to the doctor. And I had to endure 10 more years of the agony and the loneliness and the despair of alcoholism when we found ourselves alcoholic, defeated by a self-imposed crisis. You know, in 1984, I met a lady. God, did we have relationships, Rejoice. She had a son, 15 years old, tremendous athlete. I was going to relive my life through that boy. And you know what's amazing for me? The things I plan just don't ever seem to work out. I can get there, but I can't stay there. And one more time, August the 5th, 1986, my life took a nosedive. He got busted for a little indiscretion, similar to what they used to talk to me about. Wasn't a major offense. It was just possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. Yeah. I don't know. I could get there, but I couldn't stay there. I found myself at 3 o'clock in the morning in our breakfast room, and the same feelings I had had in 1976, 10 years and 1 month later, were as overwhelming as they were in 1976. There wasn't anything ever going to be all right. And I remember screaming, "My God, I have got to have help." Bill Wilson says in his story, and I believe this with all my heart today, "Thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans. When we want Him bad enough, He's there." And I surrendered for a brief moment, September the 28th, 1996. And because of God's grace, I have not had a drink since September the 29th, 1986. And it's because of you people and a loving God that works through you. You know, I started this journey in recovery, and God, there's a lot of people from my home group that I sobered up in, and that's scary because they remember how squirrely I was when I got here. And Opal and Eva remind me of that on an ongoing basis. They won't ever let me forget that. When Mary was talking Friday night about wanting to look good and wanted you to ask where she lived and what kind of car Opal looked at me and grinned. Does that tell you something? I was looking good when I got here, but I was dying. And I couldn't ask you for help. And what's amazing for me is that part of my disease tells me I don't need you. Redoy said it. Larry said it. Mary said it. Leave me the hell alone. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. You know what's scary? I had a son in April of 1986 call me. And when Charlotte handed me the phone, the first thing he said to me was, "Daddy, I hate your guts." I took the phone away from my ear. And I put my phone back to the ear, or ear back to the phone or something. And took another drink of my Miller Lite. See, if you drink Miller Lite, you can't be an alcoholic. You're just a good old boy. And he said, "You want to know why I hate your guts?" And I said, "Not really, Sean. And I'm getting aggravated." He said, "Well, I'm going to tell you why I hate your guts. Because there's always been somebody there to pick up the pieces for you." And one more lie bit the dust. I could no longer say, leave me alone. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. And you know, I hung around this fellowship, coming to meetings, and I don't know if anybody else has felt the way I did, but I thought, my God, if I can just quit drinking, everything will be okay. And I'd been hanging around this fellowship about 10 months. Longer away from a drink of alcohol than I'd been since I was 12 years old. And what this book says on page 19 hit me like a ton of bricks. It says the elimination of the drinking problem is but a beginning. I made a lot of meetings. That treatment center I went through, that 28-day spin dry jitter joint, they didn't tell me to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. They said, you'll have to go to a meeting every day for the rest of your life. And they said, maybe that'll be enough for you. I was doing that. And I remember I went to a noon meeting, and boy, was I on a spiritual high. I had found recovery. I was bitching because my wife wasn't on my schedule for recovery in an open discussion meeting. She wasn't going to near enough Al-Anon meetings. My son was doing a little recreational cocaine. And I never will forget that day after that meeting, a man walked up to me and he said, Mickey, have you read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous? Little old, drawn up, 80-something-year-old man. And I thought, what do you want with me? And then I put on my AA smile and I said, yes, sir. I've read that book several times. And he got real quiet and he looked at me and he says, do you have a learning disability? Thank God for Doc. You know, I lost that old man March the 3rd last year. But that's the man who did what this book says to do. It says in our book, chapter Working with Others, that we're to walk side by side with a new man, one day at a time. And that's what that old man did. And I don't know, I hear people struggle with steps 1, 2, and 3. I didn't have any problem with them. Doc looked at me and he said, Mickey, it's obvious you're powerless over alcohol, that your life's unmanageable. I don't care whether you believe there's some power greater than you that'll restore you to sanity or not. And he said, as far as making a decision, forget it. You have made too many bad ones all your life. I made this one for you. We're going to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as I understand Him. Thank God for people who love me and didn't give a darn about my feelings. Ms. Opal, Don C., Joe, people like y'all that knew how sick I was, that knew I didn't have the capacity to make any kind of decision. And that old man told me we're going to do a searching and fearless moral inventory. And I thought, oh boy. And we did. And he pointed to me that that's the only thing this fellowship had to offer me. And he told me that. And God was off track on. Thank God for sponsors. You know where it says if you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it? God, I like some of those Mercedes I saw. And I hadn't worn tailor-made suits in a while. I couldn't afford them anymore. And you know what Doc told me the only thing this program has to offer? A new attitude and a new relationship with our Creator. I didn't know that's what it meant. If you want what we have. God, Some of you had good-looking wives, too. Yeah? Doc, when we got to step 12, he had to explain to me what practice these principles in all your affairs means. It did not mean what I used to think it meant. I had to look at Mickey, and I had to find the things in me that were blocking me, and I didn't want to do that because I knew about them. See, I didn't want to look at the fact that my oldest son, my first son, when Jimmy was born, I denied his birth. I knew that. I'd been carrying that for a lot of years. I didn't want to look at the fact that when he was 5 years old, his mother called my mother and said it's time that Jimmy knows his daddy. And I jumped in that 1972 Delta 88 Royale convertible I was driving and headed down to West Palm Beach, Florida. And man, the first day I ever saw that little 5-year-old boy, we put the top down on that car and we rode all over that place. Man, we made plans to go to Disney World. That's when it opened. We made plans to go to the Florida Keys. And then the second night there, we decided to go out and have some dinner. And I hadn't been drinking because I knew I had to be on my best behavior. Any of you ever know when you had to be on your best behavior? And I thought, a couple of martinis before dinner won't hurt. I love wine with Italian food. You know? And that night when I got back to that hotel, I looked in the mirror and I couldn't stand me. I couldn't stand who I was and what I'd become. And I got drunk and I left town in the middle of the night. And I didn't want to look at that. I didn't want to look at the fact that I had stole the emotional well-being of everybody that ever loved me. The very worst thing I ever did to people that loved me was when alcohol and drugs would totally beat me to death. They'd pick me up, pick up the pieces, and after a while, they'd get comfortable and I'd get comfortable. And I didn't want to, but I'd be off and running again. And I'd been living that lie, leave me alone. I've never hurt anybody but myself. I didn't want to look at that. You know, we finally got to making that 8-step list that our book talks about. And I told Doc, I said, I don't know, I'm probably going to have trouble with this. He said, no, you won't. He said, if you met them, you mess with them, put them on the list. You know, just be willing to straighten it up. If you can't remember names, just put down places and what happened. You know, and I became willing to do that. You know, I was blessed in this program. And I don't know how many Al-Anons are out there or how many Alateens, but I love every one of you. And some of the greatest things that have happened to me in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous have come because you people shared with me. You shared the pain that I caused in people's lives who are just like you. God, I love Al-Anon family groups. There's a lady that used to be in Freeport, Louisiana that I talked to frequently before they moved to Arizona, Georgia P. And when I was having troubles with my stepson and with my sons, that lady was there for me. Thank God for Sally M. from Dallas and Albert. You know, they told me things like, when your kids are ready, we'll be there for them, and when ours are ready, you'll be there for them. You're too close to them to work with them emotionally. You may kill them. Larry talked about it last night. I understand what you were talking about, and I see the love that you have for Julius and his wife. Yeah, it's just the way this program is. It's just that way. You know, a lot of things have happened to me in this program, and I was blessed with a wife who, when we got to this fellowship, we'd been married 2 years, and it was in trouble, big time. And that woman seemed to take to Al-Anon and start doing the things that were necessary. And we'd get invited to conferences to share. We had the privilege of having so many people in our home, like Eugene and Jeanette, Vicki, people that we shared with. God, I'm sitting here looking at a lady that's soon to be 9 years. Never will forget when she went to Eureka Springs with us to springtime in the Ozarks. God, was that a trip. And here she is in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, sober today. You know, I want to share with you some of my journey. You know what this book says in Bill's story? Says that his friend told him when he had done these things that he would have the elements of a way of living that solved all his problems. And he was talking about the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Only at that time it was the 6 steps of the Oxford group. Said that he would have the elements of a way of living that solved all his problems. You know, at 3 years sober in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, I got fired. And you know what's amazing to me? Because you people told me, and I heard sponsorship, I heard commitment, I heard steps, I heard traditions. And they said, those are the things that are going to save you. And because you told me, and I didn't believe you when I got here, that I never had to take another drink of alcohol. In 1989, when I got fired, I was in Lafayette, Louisiana. And they called me on Wednesday, and I'd been to a meeting there that Tuesday night, I think at Turning Point on 8th Street in Lafayette. And I called my office that day at noon on Wednesday, and they said, Friday will be your last day. And I went to a meeting in Lafayette. I wanted to be with you. And I didn't drink. And what you told me was so true. Exactly about 6 days later, I found myself with a graduate assistantship going to graduate school at Northeast Louisiana University. God, how do you get there from where I was? I don't know. But I know this, you can't do it without God. Just can't do it. And I was in the first week of graduate school, and I got a phone call from Sean, the same one that told me he hated my guts in '86. And my daughter Heidi had been in a head-on collision in Mobile, Alabama, and was not expected to live. And he said, here's the doctor's name. I can't talk to you, Daddy. And I called Mobile, and the doctor called me back, and he said, Mr. Strother, said, your daughter's in bad shape. I don't know whether she's going to live or how much longer she'll be here. She's got 14 broken ribs, both lungs are collapsed, the right leg's destroyed, and if she lives, she'll never walk. And I told Charlotte, I got to go to Alabama. And I packed a bag, and I packed an album of conference tapes. And I got to Slidell, and I stopped and had dinner that night. And you know, the whole way there, I knew that whatever took place was going to be okay. Didn't know what it was going to be. And I got there. And you know, I used to ask Doc, God, Doc, how do you make amends for stealing the emotional well-being of a human being? He said, Mickey, I don't know. You just be willing to. God's going to provide the opportunity. And when it happens, He'll provide the words. You just be willing to do it. And I never will forget that Monday morning, she was going back into surgery for the second or third time. And her mother had finally gotten there from Florida. And Sigrid is a tough lady, believe me. She's one that didn't put up with me. she got me out of the house after a little over 2 years of my drunken madness and 2 children in less than 3 years, and she got rid of me, folks. She didn't need Al-Anon. You know, I used to say that woman stole my kids. She saved them, folks. She didn't steal them. I threw them away. And that morning when Heidi was going back into surgery, that woman totally lost it. And for the first time ever in my adult life, I was able to be there emotionally for my ex-wife. I was able to be there emotionally for my daughter. And God allowed me to be there emotionally for myself. I don't know. But I do know that whatever He's got in mind is far better than what Mickey's got in mind. All I got to do is look at my track record. And you know, on Friday of that following week, my daughter looked up at me and said, "Daddy, this is a special day." And I said, "Oh, you bet it is, Heidi. You're getting better." She said, "No, Daddy, it's your 3rd birthday in AA. And you need to be in Monroe, getting your chip at your home group. And I'm going to be okay, Daddy." And I drove to Monroe, Louisiana, because I knew she was going to be okay. Never will forget when Rose got that desire chip that night. She's sitting here over 7 years sober in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. 5 years sober. Doing what you people told me to do. I did it one more time and I surrendered to God. And I said, "God, I'm willing to go wherever you want me to go." I wound up in Nederland, Texas. I'd left Nederland, Texas in 1973. Wrote a hot check to get 2 Foot Lockers to put all my belongings in. Wrote a hot check to the bus company to ship it back to Louisiana. Hated that town up there 21 miles. Always wound up back in Farmable. Any of y'all ever go home to Mama? You know she's the only one that's going to put up with you. I wound up back in Nederland, Texas. And another part of my journey in this fellowship started to take place. You know, I went over there, and I remember when I told a friend of mine, he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to be teaching at Lamar University." And he looked at me, and he said, "God, higher education in Texas must be really in bad trouble if they're hiring you." And you know, I got over there and I started doing what y'all told me to do. And eventually my wife came over. She went back and forth for a while. I found out that she wasn't real thrilled with that situation. And you know one thing that comes to mind, right? You know what? That 4th time I got married, I got to tell you all this. I met that lady in February the 13th to be exact. And somewhere around March or April, she told me that maybe I needed to get a job. Man, I hadn't worked for about a year. And I never will forget, she said, I think it was sometime probably in July, she looked at me and said, "Mickey, if we're going to get married, you're going to have to get a job." And I did. I went to work for Magnolia Liquor Company. I got the job in July, we got married in August, and I got fired in October. And, you know, I got that graduate degree, and I wound up in Texas, and she finally got there. And I noticed that things were different. I can't explain it to you. I don't know how to. But I know that the relationship we had changed. And I started to see that I didn't know the woman that I was living with. And I didn't know where this lady came from that had moved in with me. And I never will forget, June of 95, I told her we needed to talk. And I don't think I'll ever forget her screaming at me that day. And I remember talking to my sponsor. And I said, Dick, why is this happening to me? And any of you that know Dick says, why isn't it happening to you? I said, Dick, I'm going to meetings. I'm working with other people. I'm in a maximum security prison at least one day a week. Why is this happening to me? He said, I don't know. Do an inventory and look at your part in it. And that's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to look at what she was doing. Thank God for sponsors. I never will forget when I called Doc one day, probably about 1987, dry a little while in this program, and I told him, Doc, I've had it. I'm quitting my job and I'm going to leave Charlotte. Doc quietly said, what are you basing that decision on? I said, it's in the book. He said, what? I said, it's in the book. Job or no job, wife or no wife. He says, fool, that don't mean you. He said, that means if you ain't got a job or if you hadn't got a wife, it does not mean quit your job and your wife. Thank God for sponsors. Left to my own direction, I get in trouble every time. You know, I had to look at that. 1992, and I'm going back a little, folks. You remember I said I left Palm Beach June of 1972 drunk in the middle of the night? Well, the summer of 92, I had done some more inventory work. And for the first time ever, I became willing to make amends to my oldest son's mother. Because, see, I had finally done what our book says. Disregarding what others had done, I resolutely looked for my own mistakes. And I was willing to make amends to her for the first time ever. And in December of 92, I got a phone call from my mother, and she said, would you like to know where Jimmy is? And I said, yeah. She gave me a number, and I called it, and for the first time in over 20 years, I talked to my son. And in July of 93, I walked off of an airplane in Charlotte, North Carolina. I looked at me at 26 years old. I kept throwing them away, and God just keeps giving them back. But I want to tell you, be careful what you pray for. Because I not only got him, I got Terry back too. His mother came as a package deal, folks. And that's not all bad either. She and I have started to establish a relationship, long distance over the phone. And I struggle with that relationship, and he and I both struggle with it. And I don't think that he would mind me saying that he's been trying to sober up since 1984, the age of 17. And it got to where he wouldn't talk to me. And I'd call every now and then, trying to keep communication open. And that's what y'all taught me to do. That the amends are mine to make. And this past year, things got extremely bad. And his mother called me one day and says, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. And you know, I'd done something a few months earlier. I'd given him Tom I's phone number because Tom lived in North Carolina. And I said, son, I can't help you. But if you need some help, call this number and this man will be willing to talk to you. And that particular November day, November the 16th, Terry told me, she says, Mickey, I'm afraid he's not going to make it this time. And I said, Terry, I don't know. But if he'll talk to me, have him call me. And on November the 18th, he called me. And I asked him, I said, son, what do you want to do? He says, I want help. I said, what are you willing to do? He said, whatever. I said, are you willing to come to Texas? And I'm going to tell you, I have never been so surprised by the answer I received. He said, yes. I'm the man that he called the sperm donor. And I told him, I said, just wait a few minutes, son, and I'll call you back and I'll tell you what plane to be on. And on November the 19th, I picked him up at Hobby Airport in Houston, Texas, and we went to my place, and we had something to eat, and we went to a meeting of my home group, which is the Lewis Drive group of Port Arthur, Texas. And the next day, I got up at 8 o'clock and I went to school and I taught 10 minutes of a class. And I put a film on and I ran to the courthouse in Beaumont, which is about 20 miles away. And I did one of the toughest things I've ever had to do in my life. But you taught me that my emotional sobriety is what my physical sobriety hinges on. And that more so than that what our book talks about is when we address the spiritual malady, we get better mentally and physically. And I had to do something that's probably the toughest thing I've ever done in my life, because I got a divorce from a woman I loved dearly. But you see, my book says, though we don't like their symptoms and the way they affect us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. And I went back to school at 9:30 and I taught another class. And at noon I took him and I put him in a treatment center. Just an average day in the life of a recovering alcoholic. No big deal. Trust God, clean house, work with others, put one foot in front of the other. And I was at another meeting that night. You know, I was sharing something outside, and I talked a little bit earlier about the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And it's God's grace and God's grace alone that I am not doing hard time in somebody's penitentiary somewhere. And I've had the privilege over the last 5 years of working with some of the finest members of Alcoholics Anonymous I've ever seen in my life. And they don't decide what they're going to put on every morning when they get up. They don't look ahead over their day and figure out where they're going. They don't even decide what they eat. And you know, God has blessed me so much. 2 years ago, God loves me so much. Maximum security prison in the state of Texas, where men don't touch, men surely don't tell each other they love each other. They don't hug. I got the privilege of being on my knees with 130 men who were in a room because they wanted to be there, who were holding hands, and who did the third step prayer of Alcoholics Anonymous. And when it was over, we were hugging each other. And the guards were looking like, what in the world is going on? The love that you find in this program. Some of you have been able to meet that young man this weekend that I threw away over 29 years ago. You know, it's amazing to me, and I love Chuck Chamberlain. Chuck used to say something, if one of us is God's kid, we all. If one of us isn't, none of us are. And he'd say, I am, so don't y'all worry. I'd like to bring you Chuck's message. Y'all don't worry today. You know, up until November the 19th, 1996, I had seen my son 5 days. I spent the first Thanksgiving I ever spent with him. I spent the first Christmas I ever spent with him. And because you people invited me up here this weekend, my son got to meet his grandmother for the first time ever. And he'll be 30 on April the 3rd this year. I don't know. Y'all called me over a year ago and he didn't come down till November. I don't know how God knew all this was going to happen. You can't know what you've done for me this weekend. And you told me simply, you don't ever have to drink again if you don't want to. I don't know, some of you have gotten to know that young man this weekend. I saw him getting phone numbers. God, it's scary. You know? Whew. I need to talk about that daughter that was almost killed in 1989. My dad passed away in 1994, and that man was 16 years sober, but he did it some other way. So I know there are other ways to recover. My experience has been in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I got to do this, God. He was diagnosed with 3 terminal inoperable tumors in July the 4th, 94. And in August of 96, he was called home. But because you people cared more about me than my feelings, and you told me the hard things I needed to hear. I was sober almost 8 years in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he and I had been able to repair a relationship that had been totally torn apart. You know, I used to wonder how that poor man felt coming to Florida and all those places to get me out of jail. You know what I forgot to tell y'all? My dad was chief of police and was for over 24 years, and it's an elected office. And I remember that day, that Saturday morning, I won't ever forget it because it was a gift from God. And he was laying up there in that bed in the St. Francis Hospital, and this is going to tell you something about my ego, and you've already found out a little bit about that animal. We all got them. They're God-given. Joe McHugh taught me that, but there's a proper use of them, you know. And I walked up to that bed, and my dad was laying there in a fetal position, 6'2", 250 pounds. And I kissed him, Larry. And he said, son, I can't wake up. I said, Daddy, you hadn't got to. I just want you to know I love you. And I visited with my mother a minute. And I got ready to leave that room. And I walked back up there and I kissed him. And I did his hair like this. And his eyes never opened. He never moved. He said, boy, don't you mess up my hair. I knew all was right in God's world, folks. And within 30 minutes, he was called home. And because of you people, I didn't have to drink. I don't know. I'll tell you what. Whatever God's got in mind for Mickey is far better than what Mickey's got in mind for Mickey. Look at my track record. You know, that daughter, I hadn't seen her since his funeral. And she's the one that was always closest to Daddy, and she was always there. And I haven't talked to her in over 2 years. Got a call from a bail bondsman in Houston, Texas, a few weeks ago. I know about running with the pretty people. Any of y'all know about running with the pretty people? Seems that she was supposed to be in court for a hearing, and she had jumped bond on a felony theft charge. And then I found out she had spent Thanksgiving in the Harris County Jail. I don't know if she's drinking and drugging. If she isn't, God, she's missing a good opportunity. You know? And this is her story, but it's a part of mine. That grandmother that Jimmy met yesterday, Heidi stole one of her credit cards last year and ran up about $8,000 on it. Got another one issued using her Social Security number, ran up about another $8,000 to $10,000. That's God's kid, folks. I love her. Save her a seat, Al-Anon or AA, whichever way. God, she qualifies for Al-Anon, you know. I don't know. But I know this. That ain't my business. That's God's business. Somebody will be there for her when she's ready. Does it hurt? You better believe it does. But I'm going to tell you this. Bill Wilson was not lying when he said that we would have the elements of a way of living that solved all our problems. And all that's necessary is a few simple steps. But they ain't easy. And I had to have somebody show me how to take the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous so I could have a new attitude and a new relationship with my Creator. And I don't know if there's anybody in this room that's like I was. I didn't want a thing to do with God when I got here. But y'all kept telling me, make a commitment. And you know, our book says something on page 164 that I believe with all my heart. It says, see to it that your relationship with Him is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. It says this is a great fact for us. God. And you know what I understand today? The only way I can see that my relationship with my Creator is right is if I clear up all the wreckage that I've caused in your lives. And that's the only way possible for me to see that my relationship with Him is right. And I never knew I had a purpose in life. I used to say, why am I here? Why don't you just go ahead and take me? And I found my purpose in this book. And it's in there if you want to look for it. I won't tell you what page it's on, but it tells you what your real purpose is. And I struggle with a spiritual thing. I didn't know. My goodness, how do you live a spiritual life? And it's real simple. It's in the book. You take a position. He's the director. He's the principal. We're the agent. He's the father. We're the kid. You know? And I struggle with, how do you perfect and enlarge on a spiritual way of living? And it's amazing. You know, I found it in this book, and for a lot of years I didn't know. I looked everywhere. And I want you to listen to what old Bill says at the bottom of page 14. If an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life, here's the formula. You ready? Through work and self-sacrifice for others. That's the formula that kept me from drinking when my daughter was almost killed. It's the formula that kept me from drinking when my dad died, when I got fired, when I divorced a woman I loved. Kept me from drinking when I was afraid my son was going to die on the streets of Charlotte, North Carolina. Because you know what it says? It says, if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. And that's the only reason I was able to survive the trials and low spots, and it's called God's grace. And they're going to happen to you. But I'm here to tell you that my experience is, if you don't think this design for living works, you make a commitment and you get a sponsor who's got a sponsor who's done the steps the way the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous says to do them. And if you're like I was, and you don't think God loves you, just give Him a chance to show you. I love y'all. Thank you.